There's a claim circulating inside Cleveland sports media that has picked up serious momentum. And the more it gets repeated without challenge, the more people start accepting it as settled truth, without ever stopping to ask where it actually came from or whether the evidence actually supports it. The claim is this: Shedeur Sanders doesn't know what he's looking at on a football field. He can't read defenses. He doesn't know how to flip protections. He doesn't know when he's hot. He doesn't watch film. He can only throw to receivers who are already wide open and has no ability to make tight window throws. Those aren't gentle critiques. That's not the kind of measured analysis you'd expect from someone covering a developing rookie quarterback. That is a full demolition of a young player's football intelligence, stated not as opinion, not as possibility, but as established fact sourced from inside the building. And here is the part that makes this entire situation worth examining very carefully. The tape doesn't match, not partially, not in certain situations, it doesn't match at all. And once you understand what the film actually shows, and once you dig into the debate that exploded between G. Bush and Tyvis Powell on the Ultimate Cleveland show, the picture that emerges isn't just about one quarterback's ability. It's about something much bigger. It's about how narratives get built around young players, how those narratives spread, who benefits from them spreading, and why the language used to frame a story matters just as much as the information itself. By the time we get to the end of this, you're going to see this situation completely differently. Because there are layers here that the loudest voices in this debate have either missed entirely or chosen to avoid. Let's get into all of it. Start with the play. Watch it without any commentary telling you what to think. Just observe what actually happens on the field. Shedeur Sanders walks to the line of scrimmage. The defense is presenting pressure. Before the ball is even snapped, he is already working. His eyes move immediately to the safety positioned high in the middle of the field. He clocks the threat. He processes what the coverage structure is communicating to him. He identifies where the danger lives and where the opportunity might open up. The ball gets snapped. Here is where it gets interesting. Post-snap, Shedeur doesn't lock onto his primary receiver and stare him down. He does something much more deliberate. He looks back at that safety. Not because he's confused, not because he doesn't know what he's looking at. He looks back at that safety specifically to hold him, to make that defensive back believe, just for a half second, that the throw is going somewhere else, to freeze him in place long enough for the window to crack open down the middle of the field. That half second of manufactured hesitation is the entire play. Then Shedeur resets. He adjusts his back foot slightly to get a cleaner angle. He sees the window the moment it appears, and he delivers the ball not into empty space, not to a receiver standing alone with nobody near him, but between two defenders who are closing fast. The placement is low and away from the contact zone. That keeps his receiver from getting demolished the instant the ball arrives. 1 count, 2 count, 3 count, clean release, no hesitation, precisely located. Now stop and think about what we just watched. We were told this quarterback can only throw to wide open receivers. The receiver on that play was not wide open. He created the separation by holding the safety. We were told he can't make tight window throws. The throw on that play went between two closing defenders with deliberate low-away placement. We were told he doesn't know what he's looking at. He identified the safety pre-snap, used his eyes post-snap to manipulate that safety's positioning, and delivered the ball into the window his manipulation created. We were told he doesn't know when he's hot. He trusted his protection for exactly the right amount of time, not too long, not too short, and got the ball out before the pocket collapsed. Every single claim, contradicted by a single play. Now, one play is not a complete evaluation. Nobody reasonable is arguing that. But one play absolutely destroys the idea that these critiques are grounded in undeniable, consistent evidence. Because if the claim is that he never does these things and fundamentally can't do these things, watching him do all of them cleanly in one sequence is a significant problem for the narrative. This wasn't a trick play. This wasn't a designed rollout where the defense had no chance to react. This was a standard NFL drop-back read-and-throw situation. He diagnosed it, manipulated it, trusted it, and executed it. So the real question isn't whether the play happened. You can watch it yourself. The real question is, why is the narrative so confidently running in the exact opposite direction of what the tape is showing? And that question leads directly to the person at the center of all of this. Jason Lloyd is not a random voice. That distinction matters, and it needs to be stated clearly before anything else gets said about his reporting. He has covered the Cleveland Browns for years. He has genuine access to the facility. He has real relationships with real people inside the organization. When he reports something, it isn't fabricated from nothing. It comes from conversations, from sources, from the kind of proximity that most reporters covering this team simply don't have. That credibility is real. It matters. And dismissing it entirely is just as intellectually dishonest as accepting everything he says without scrutiny. But here is the thing that often gets lost when people debate the credibility of sources. Credibility and responsible framing are two completely separate things. A reporter can have genuine access to real information and still frame that information in ways that go beyond what the evidence actually supports. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. And the way these particular claims were framed is where the legitimate questions begin. There is a meaningful difference, a genuinely important difference, between saying sources inside the building suggest Shedeur struggled with certain protection concepts early in his development, and saying he doesn't know what he's looking at. One of those statements opens a conversation. It acknowledges the reality that all young quarterbacks go through developmental phases, that learning NFL concepts takes time, that early struggles are part of the process rather than a permanent verdict. The other statement closes the conversation before it starts. It presents a conclusion as established fact. It tells everyone listening that the question has already been answered, and the answer is damning. Permanent-sounding labels on developing players are extraordinarily dangerous, not because they can never contain a grain of truth, but because once they attach, they start filtering every future evaluation. Every incomplete pass becomes confirmation. Every protection mistake becomes proof. Every checkdown becomes evidence of exactly what the label already told you to expect. The label becomes the story, and the story becomes the lens through which everyone watches the player. What makes this situation even more worth examining is something G. Bush pointed out with precision: the selective nature of who was amplifying these specific claims. Other Cleveland beat reporters with comparable building access, people like Tony Grossi and Mary Kay Cabot, who have been in that ecosystem for years and have their own sources and relationships, were not running with the same definitive language. The reporting wasn't echoing across the beat. It was concentrated in one specific lane and being repeated consistently from that one source. That doesn't automatically make the claims false. Different reporters have different sources. Different people in the building have different perspectives and different axes to grind. Information gets filtered through relationships and agendas that outsiders rarely have full visibility into. But if these things were as obvious and as widely held as the framing suggested, if everyone inside the building genuinely believed this quarterback had no idea what he was looking at, the consensus would typically surface more broadly. It would show up in multiple reporting streams, not just one. The fact that it didn't is a thread worth pulling. And pulling it leads straight into the conversation that actually blew this whole thing wide open. The ultimate Cleveland show has carved out a real space in Brown's discourse because it actually lets different voices clash without forcing artificial consensus. People disagree on that show in ways that feel genuine rather than performed. And the back and forth between G. Bush and Tyvis Powell about Jason Lloyd's claims became something more significant than a typical media debate. It became a genuine collision between two fundamentally different views about how NFL reporting should work and what responsibility comes with platform. Tyvis Powell entered the conversation from a fair and thoughtful position. He was transparent about the fact that he'd been flooded with questions about what Lloyd had said. He acknowledged that Lloyd has real building access and real sources. He made a reasonable case that Lloyd isn't manufacturing things from nothing, that when a reporter with genuine proximity to an organization says something, it usually comes from somewhere. He also drew a distinction that was actually quite important. He argued that what Lloyd thinks of Shedeur Sanders as a human being and what he thinks of him as a football player are two separate things. That Lloyd's reporting comes from professional assessment rather than personal animosity. Those are legitimate points. Beat reporters with building access don't typically invent information wholesale. The existence of sources matters. But Tyvis went a step further in his defense of Lloyd, and that step is where G. Bush pressed back. Because there's a difference between defending a reporter's access and defending the specific language that reporter chose to use. And G. Bush's pushback was never really about whether Lloyd has sources. It was about what Lloyd did with those sources when he chose to translate private conversations into public declarations. The definitive nature of the language. That was the core of G. Bush's argument. When you say a developing quarterback struggled early with certain protections, you're reporting development. You're describing a phase that virtually every young quarterback goes through. You're creating space for the possibility of growth, for coaching to make a difference, for the natural progression that football development requires. When you say that same quarterback doesn't know what he's looking at, you're issuing a verdict. You're telling your audience that the evaluation is complete, the results are in and they aren't good. You're not describing a phase, you're describing a ceiling. And G. Bush made a point that cuts directly to the heart of this whole debate. You cannot simultaneously say a quarterback doesn't know something and say he's been meeting with the head coach every single day working on that exact thing. Because if he's actively being taught and actively showing up to learn, the accurate characterization is that he's developing, not that he fundamentally can't. Those aren't two versions of the same story. They're two different stories. And presenting one of them as definitively true while the evidence of the other is sitting right there in plain sight is where reporting stops being reporting and starts being something else. The conversation on the Ultimate Cleveland show got heated partly because the two sides kept slightly missing each other. Tyvis was defending the credibility of the source. G. Bush was challenging the responsibility of the framing. Both of those are valid conversations, but they're answering different questions. And the most important question, what does the actual evidence show, kept almost getting swallowed by the argument about the argument. That evidence question is the one that matters most. And when you look at it clearly, the film room contradiction that emerged is one of the hardest things to explain away. Here is where the math stops working for the "he doesn't watch film" version of this story. Multiple separate reports confirmed throughout the season that Shedeur Sanders was meeting with Kevin Stefanski on a daily basis. This wasn't occasional. This wasn't a couple of times a week when the schedule allowed. Every day. He was coming in before the rest of the team to go through film, protections, coverage structures, and playbook concepts with the head coach. He was staying late. There were extra sessions, the kind that people around NFL facilities call hungry dog periods, where players voluntarily put in work after official practice ends because they want the extra reps, the extra mental repetitions, the extra edge that the standard schedule doesn't provide. A Sports Illustrated piece that surfaced during the season specifically called out his preparation approach as a positive. Multiple reporters around the facility noted his constant iPad work. The picture that coverage painted was not of a player coasting through his rookie year on physical tools. It was of a young quarterback grinding relentlessly to understand the system he'd been dropped into. So now try to make these two pictures fit together. Shedeur Sanders doesn't watch film. Shedeur Sanders was also in the facility every morning going over film with the head coach of an NFL franchise. One of those things has to give. Because if both were true simultaneously, if he was physically present in those film sessions every morning and somehow absorbing absolutely nothing from them, then the failure isn't his. That's a coaching failure of historic proportions. You'd be talking about a situation where the head coach spent weeks of daily sessions teaching a player and produced zero comprehension. That's not a quarterback development problem. That's a fundamental breakdown of communication and instruction. If the preparation reports were accurate, and multiple independent sources suggested they were, then the "he doesn't watch film" claim is at minimum a severe distortion of a more complicated reality. Maybe he struggled early to process what he was watching. Maybe the concepts were taking longer to translate from film to field than the coaching staff hoped. Maybe there was a period where the volume of information was overwhelming, in ways that any fifth-round rookie quarterback joining a new system mid-process would find overwhelming. Those things would be developmental concerns. They would be worth reporting. They would be legitimate topics for discussion. But they are not the same thing as saying he doesn't watch film and doesn't want to learn. And the gap between those two characterizations is enormous. G. Bush articulated this exactly. If Shedeur is watching film every single morning, one of two things is happening. Either he's being taught incorrectly, meaning the coaching staff isn't showing him how to properly translate what he sees on screen into what he needs to do on the field, which is a development staff problem, or the reports about his preparation habits are inaccurate, which raises serious questions about how information is being managed and sourced. Neither of those possibilities supports the original definitive claim. Both of them land somewhere much more complicated and much more honest than "he just doesn't care about film." But the practice rep situation sitting underneath all of this is arguably the most significant piece of the puzzle. And it's the piece that keeps getting glossed over in ways that should make everyone more uncomfortable than the current conversation suggests. This part of the Shedeur Sanders story deserves far more attention than it has received, because what happened with his practice reps isn't a minor footnote. It's a foundational context issue that changes how every other piece of evidence should be interpreted. During OTAs, the organized team activities designed specifically to give quarterbacks time to build familiarity with the system, develop chemistry with receivers, and work through playbook concepts in a low-pressure environment. Shedeur Sanders was not receiving meaningful reps with the first-team offense. This was happening during what the organization was publicly framing as an open quarterback competition. But if the competition was genuinely open, the logical approach would be rotating the competing quarterbacks through first-team situations to see how each one handles them. That rotation didn't happen in any meaningful way. That raised eyebrows among people watching closely. OTAs are exactly the kind of environment where you want to give a young quarterback real work. No crowd pressure, no game stakes, no consequences for mistakes beyond the learning opportunity they create. It's the safest possible space for development. And that space wasn't being used to develop the player at the center of the competition. Then training camp arrived. Reports emerged of Shedeur working on a separate field from the main group at various points during practice. Some people latched onto those reports immediately as confirmation that something was seriously wrong specifically with Shedeur. The interpretation was that separation from the main group signaled the coaching staff managing a problem case. But here is the detail that those same people either didn't know or chose not to mention. Dillon Gabriel also worked on a separate field at various points during that same training camp. Dillon also had individual sessions with coaches separate from the main group. The physical separation from the main practice field wasn't unique to Shedeur's situation. And yet the narrative attached to Gabriel's separation was completely different. Nobody was treating Gabriel's time on a separate field as evidence of a fundamental learning problem. Nobody was citing it as proof that he couldn't process the playbook. The double standard in how the same situation was being framed for two different players on the same roster is something that deserves direct acknowledgement. Because if physical separation during camp is damning evidence for one player, it should be at least a talking point for the other. And it wasn't. There's context worth adding here. Dillon Gabriel came into the Browns system with familiarity with certain offensive concepts from his college background, running a wide zone scheme. He had a head start on particular fundamentals that Shedeur didn't have. That's a genuine advantage. And that advantage contributed to Gabriel being able to get first-team reps earlier in the process, which is normal developmental progression. But here's where the situation stops being normal. Once Joe Flacco stepped away from the starting position, the organizational math changes completely. At that point, the player behind Flacco on the depth chart is one snap away from playing in a live NFL game every single week. That's not a hypothetical future scenario. That's the literal weekly reality of what it means to be a backup quarterback in professional football. If your backup isn't being prepared to play, if he's not getting meaningful first-team reps, if he hasn't worked extensively with the offensive line he might need to depend on, if the communication systems and audible structures haven't been drilled to the point of instinct, then you haven't made a developmental decision. You've made a gamble. And when Shedeur Sanders was called upon to start, reports indicated he didn't get consistent first-team reps until the week of his actual start. The week of, not weeks before. Not a gradual increase in first-team work as the situation became clearer. The week he was going to play. Think about what that practically means. You're asking a player to manage NFL speed pre-snap communication, NFL speed coverage reads, and NFL speed decision-making with a group of offensive linemen he's barely worked with in live game speed situations. Against defensive packages, he studied on film but hasn't executed against with the ones in real reps. Under pressure that no amount of individual film study fully prepares you for without the physical repetition to back it up. That's not player development. That's organizational negligence wearing the costume of player evaluation. And when people point to Shedeur's starting performances as evidence of his limitations, which is a fair conversation to have about the actual film, you have to ask the foundational question first. What were we actually evaluating? A quarterback who received every reasonable developmental resource and still couldn't deliver? Or a quarterback thrown into a live game situation with compromised preparation, a struggling offensive line, and an unstable coaching environment, and asked to perform at an NFL starter level while simultaneously being evaluated on whether he could perform at an NFL starter level? The answer to that question doesn't just affect how you grade the performances. It determines whether the evaluation was even valid. When you strip away the noise and the argument and the back and forth about sources and credibility, the Shedeur Sanders situation breaks into two competing narratives, and both of them have genuine supporters making genuine arguments. The first narrative says the tape revealed real limitations that existed independent of the surrounding circumstances, that there were moments where defenses gave him manageable looks and he still couldn't execute cleanly, that certain mechanical tendencies under pressure showed up consistently enough to be concerning rather than incidental, that the statistics, whatever context you want to apply to them, are what they are, and that evaluating Shedeur favorably requires explaining away too many things for too many consecutive situations. That's not an unreasonable position. If you're building your case purely from outcomes and are unmoved by contextual arguments, those outcomes exist and they support a skeptical view. The second narrative says the evaluation itself was fundamentally compromised before a single game snap was ever taken, that Kevin Stefanski's ability to develop quarterbacks was already being questioned around the league, and his track record at that specific aspect of head coaching was concerning even before Shedeur arrived. That the offensive line situation was bad enough to compromise any quarterback's decision-making and pocket management, let alone a rookie's. That the rep situation described above made a fair evaluation essentially impossible. And here's what makes the second narrative harder to dismiss than the loudest voices on the first side would like. Former NFL quarterbacks who have studied the game at the highest professional level watched the same tape that everyone else had access to and came away with notably different conclusions. Chase Daniel, whose entire career was built on understanding football from a backup quarterback's perspective, and who has developed genuine credibility as an analyst of quarterback play, broke down specific plays where Shedeur correctly diagnosed coverage looks and made the right reads. He pointed to moments against the Buffalo Bills where the pre-snap processing was accurate and the post-snap execution matched the read. Chase Daniel is not a casual observer. He played the position. He knows what real processing looks like from the inside. Bernie Kosar, whose emotional investment in Cleveland football runs decades deep, and who has no particular incentive to oversell a young player's ability, watched plays and identified moments where Shedeur's diagnosis was actually quite sound. His words carried the weight of someone who has analyzed quarterbacks seriously for a long time. Kurt Warner, broadly considered one of the most analytically precise quarterback evaluators working in media, offered positive assessments of specific moments in Shedeur's film that the negative narrative wasn't accounting for. So you have three former professionals, all of whom understand quarterback evaluation from the inside, looking at the same tape and finding things worth praising. While one beat reporter's sources are saying he has no idea what he's looking at. Both of those things can't be simultaneously and completely true. One of them is closer to the full picture than the other. Now, does that mean the concerns are completely without merit? That would be going too far in the other direction. Developing quarterbacks can show genuine flashes of competence and still have real gaps in their game. That's what development looks like. It's not linear. It's not clean. One good play and one bad play can sit next to each other in the same evaluation without either one canceling the other out. The issue isn't the existence of criticism. It's the absoluteness of it. It's the he can't, he doesn't, he never language that leaves no room for the counter-evidence that multiple credible people are pointing to in the actual film. When you have former professionals pointing to positive signs, and you still insist on framing the situation as definitively hopeless, you're not just reporting anymore. You're advocating for a predetermined conclusion. And advocating for a conclusion while packaging it as objective journalism is where things stop being fair to the player, the audience, or the truth. G. Bush's argument about the definitive nature wasn't about protecting Shedeur from legitimate criticism. It was about holding the framing to a standard that the available evidence can actually support. And right now, the available evidence doesn't support permanent verdicts. It supports a conversation that's more complicated, more honest, and considerably less satisfying for people who prefer clean answers. But before we get to what the answer actually requires, there's a pattern in how this player's story has been told that reveals something important about why the current narrative is landing the way it is. Go back before the draft. Before the Browns selected Shedeur Sanders in the 5th round, the pre-draft reporting ecosystem had circulating concerns about him that went beyond simple on-field evaluation. There were whispers about attitude, reports suggesting he had rubbed certain teams the wrong way during the pre-draft interview process, characterizations that implied character concerns, work ethic questions, red flags in how he carried himself in the controlled environment of NFL evaluations. These concerns were presented with enough frequency and specificity that they contributed meaningfully to his fall in the draft. For a quarterback with his physical tools, landing in the 5th round represented a significant slip that required explanation beyond just competitive depth at the position. The pre-draft characterization painted a picture of a prospect who required caution, not a can't-miss talent who happened to land lower than expected due to circumstance. A player with genuine question marks that organizations needed to consider carefully. Then Cleveland selected him. And almost overnight, the tone shifted. The same media ecosystem that had been circulating character concerns suddenly pivoted to reporting that Shedeur was exceptional in the building, that the coaches loved his approach, that his work ethic was standing out, that he was everything you'd want in a young quarterback's attitude and preparation habits. Both pictures existed within a very short window of time, and both can't be equally accurate representations of the same person. Either the pre-draft concerns had genuine substance, in which case the post-draft positivity was at least partly organizational management of public perception around their new investment, or the pre-draft concerns were overstated, possibly influenced by teams who wanted him to fall so they could grab him at a reduced cost, which is a documented practice in NFL pre-draft information management. There is a third possibility, that both sets of reporting captured something real, and that the truth of who Shedeur Sanders is as a professional exists somewhere in between. That he had rough edges coming out of college that he genuinely worked to address once he was in a professional environment. That people's assessments of him changed because he actually changed. That's a reasonable possibility. People develop, environments matter. But this is precisely what makes the pattern significant. Peter Schrager appeared on Pat McAfee's show after the draft and started discussing how great Shedeur had been in the Browns building. McAfee, who is not naive about how NFL information management works, pushed back directly. He pointed out that the pre-draft reporting coming from NFL Network's own orbit had characterized the situation very differently. That the attitude concerns and red flags weren't things McAfee had invented. They came from reporting that Schrager's own network was involved in amplifying. Schrager's response was to essentially pivot without fully accounting for the gap. He moved to the new narrative without reconciling it against the old one. And that moment, that quiet, unacknowledged pivot is revealing, because it shows how quickly the framing around players can shift based on where they land and what the new organizational context requires, and how rarely anyone goes back to seriously audit whether the earlier version was accurate. G. Bush referenced this pattern explicitly in the Ultimate Cleveland Show conversation. His point was straightforward. If the same media ecosystem was willing to completely flip the characterization of Shedeur's attitude and work ethic within weeks of him being drafted, moving from character concern to model professional without any serious explanation for the reversal, then accepting any single report about him as definitive becomes much more complicated. Because if the narrative was managed once, it can be managed again, in either direction. This is the context that the just trust the source defense of the film study claims has to reckon with. Sources inside NFL buildings aren't neutral observers with no stake in how stories get told. Organizations have interests, coaches have interests, players have interests, front office personnel have interests, agents have interests, and all of those interests can shape what gets shared, how it gets framed, and who gets to hear it. None of that means sources are lying, but it means that accepting what one source says about a player as settled fact, without accounting for what other evidence suggests, is a choice that reveals something about the person making it. Put a name on the source, provide corroboration, show the counter-evidence has been genuinely considered. That's what responsible reporting looks like. And that's exactly what G. Bush kept asking for throughout the whole debate. The Browns are staring at a decision that is going to define the next phase of this franchise's direction. And the noise surrounding it, the competing narratives, the media debates, the definitive claims from unnamed sources, is making it harder than it needs to be to see where the logic actually points. Here's the thing that gets missed in how heated this conversation becomes. Tyvis Powell and G. Bush actually agree on more than their argument suggested. Despite defending Lloyd's credibility as a reporter, Tyvis acknowledged openly that the situation around Shedeur's development was murky. He said the preparation handling had elements that gave him pause. He acknowledged that a 6-game sample size, whatever it showed, was not a complete or clean picture of a quarterback's ability. And he said directly, without hedging, that Shedeur not getting consistent first-team reps until the week of his start was a problem. Those aren't the words of someone who thinks the evaluation was fair and the results were definitive. That's someone who recognizes that the data produced by this situation is too compromised to support permanent conclusions. G. Bush's argument was a natural extension of exactly that recognition. Compromised data doesn't warrant permanent labels. It warrants a cleaner test. And the only way to get a genuinely clean test is to actually provide one, which hasn't happened yet. The path forward is straightforward in concept, even if executing it requires real organizational commitment. Shedeur Sanders needs to enter the upcoming season as the unquestioned starting quarterback, not after a competition, not as the declared winner of a training camp battle with a cloud of uncertainty still hovering over the depth chart, not with whispers about what happens if he struggles 3 games in. As the guy, from day one, through the final whistle of the regular season. The offensive line situation has to be addressed seriously, not as a favor extended to a player who needs special conditions, but as a basic requirement for producing an evaluation that means anything. No quarterback, not the most accomplished veterans in the league, processes cleanly when he's getting hit before his 3rd step. Asking a developing player to demonstrate NFL-level decision-making while his protection collapses on a 1/3 of his dropbacks isn't player evaluation. It's a stress test with a predetermined outcome. Adding legitimate weapons to the passing game matters for the same reason. The best quarterbacks in NFL history had supporting casts that gave defenses multiple things to worry about. Evaluating a quarterback's ability to create plays when the opposing defense has no legitimate fear of anyone else on the field isn't evaluation. It's a setup. A stable coaching staff with a coherent developmental philosophy for quarterbacks changes what the next evaluation actually measures. Kevin Stefanski's track record at developing quarterbacks was already being questioned by people who follow this team closely. A new setup with clearer developmental priorities gives the next sample data a meaning the previous one couldn't have. And first-team reps. Consistent, high-quality, game-speed first-team reps from the beginning of the offseason program through every single week of the regular season, not the week before his first start. The whole thing. Give him all of that, a complete season with a real runway, then evaluate. Because here is what happens if you don't. If the Browns move on from Shedeur before giving him a genuinely clean opportunity to be assessed, the argument never ends. Supporters will always have the legitimate case that the evaluation was too compromised to be meaningful. Critics will always have ammunition from the chaotic original sample. Both sides will dig in. The franchise spends years in exactly the kind of paralyzed narrative war that prevents clear organizational thinking. But a clean full season with real conditions produces an undeniable answer either way. If he succeeds with the right support, franchise quarterback found, move forward with conviction. If he struggles despite everything being in place, the picture is clear, and the path to the next step becomes obvious to both sides. The only evaluation worth having is one that actually tests what it claims to be testing, and that evaluation hasn't happened yet. Here is the uncomfortable thought that ties everything in this story together. The debate around Shedeur Sanders, the sourcing. The claims, the narrative flips, the selective framing, isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening inside a media environment where strong declarative takes generate far more engagement than careful nuanced assessments, where controversy creates clicks and definitive condemnation of young players drives more sharing than measured developmental analysis. He doesn't know what he's looking at travels fast. He showed some promising moments in a compromised environment and deserves a cleaner evaluation before conclusions are drawn, does not. That asymmetry creates an incentive structure that doesn't always align with accuracy. Strong claims get amplified. Corrections get buried quietly. And by the time the actual evidence has accumulated enough to contradict the original narrative, the narrative has already done most of its damage. G. Bush's frustration throughout the ultimate Cleveland show debate wasn't just about one reporter's specific claims about one quarterback. It was about recognizing a pattern, the way that strong, definitive statements about players, once launched into the media ecosystem, become self-sustaining. The way that "I heard from a source" becomes "everyone knows." The way that language chosen in one moment of reporting ends up defining a player's public identity for years. Because once a label attaches to a quarterback in the public perception, it filters everything. Once you've absorbed, he doesn't know what he's looking at enough times. Watching him make a correct read starts to feel like an exception rather than evidence. The label does the work of shaping perception before the tape even gets a fair look. And that's what's really at stake in this entire conversation. Not just whether Shedeur Sanders is a capable starting quarterback, but whether young players get evaluated on what they actually demonstrate or on what the most aggressive narrative about them has already decided they are. The tape showed a quarterback reading a safety before the snap, holding him with deliberate eye manipulation after the snap, resetting his feet to improve his throwing angle, delivering a precisely placed ball into a tight window with defenders closing in. Former NFL quarterbacks, people who played the position professionally and understand its demands from the inside, watched that tape and identified competent, intelligent processing. But the loudest narrative says he has no clue what he's looking at. Only one of those things can be right. And the fact that the narrative is gaining more traction than the tape in certain corners of this conversation should tell you something. Not necessarily about Shedeur Sanders, but about how NFL media decides who a player is, and how quickly that decision gets made before the full story has had a chance to reveal itself. One breakout season rewrites everything. History is full of quarterbacks who were written off before they were ever properly given a chance, only to prove every premature verdict wrong once the right conditions were finally in place. The NFL's most compelling redemption stories are almost always stories of players who survived the narrative long enough to let the tape make the final argument. The only question is whether that chance actually comes. And that answer is coming soon, whether the narrative is ready for it or not. Watch the tape, ask the hard questions, and the next time someone tells you a quarterback has absolutely no clue what he's doing, make them sit down and walk you through the evidence. Because the evidence has a way of being a lot more complicated than the narrative wants you to believe. And in this particular case, it's looking like the tape might have the last word after all. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This debate is far from settled, and the next chapter of this story is going to be worth paying very close attention to.